The millionaire humiliated a pregnant waitress. "You look like a whale, get out of my sight." What happened next brought him to his knees. The Hudson Manor was the crown jewel of Blake Callahan's culinary empire, a place where luxury wasn't just promised, it was served on every plate. The restaurant exuded an air of effortless sophistication, mahogany-paneled walls, velvet drapes cascading like waterfalls, and chandeliers shimmering like suspended constellations. The scent of seared duck and truffle risotto mingled with the faint aroma of polished silver, creating an ambiance that whispered exclusivity. Blake sat at his usual table by the grand window, a spot reserved only for him. Outside, the city of Boston hummed with life, but inside, the world bent to his will. He adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored navy suit, handcrafted in Milan, and took a sip of his Château Margaux, 1996. The wine was exquisite, yet his lips twitched in disappointment. Excellence had long since lost its thrill. Across the room, a waiter tripped slightly while delivering a lobster bisque to a table of socialites. Blake shook his head with disdain. "Amateurs," he muttered. To Blake Callahan, the world was divided into two categories, winners and losers, and he was certain of his place at the summit. His empire of luxury restaurants stretched across the country, with each establishment meticulously curated to attract the wealthy and influential. Success, he believed, was a matter of dominance. If you weren't crushing someone beneath your feet, you were the one being crushed. People admired his sharp instincts and ruthless efficiency, though few dared to get close. Not that it mattered to him. In his mind, warmth and kindness were the vices of the weak. As he swirled the wine in his glass, a waitress approached with a water pitcher balanced carefully on a tray. Her uniform, though spotless, struggled to accommodate the pronounced curve of her pregnant belly. Her name tag read, Naomi. Her steps were deliberate, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she feared one misstep might shatter the delicate atmosphere of the room. Blake's eyes narrowed. Why would they let someone like her work the front floor? He thought. A pregnant waitress in a high-end establishment. It's like putting a dented car in a showroom. Naomi reached his table and began pouring water into his glass. Her hands trembled slightly under the weight of the pitcher. Blake arched an eyebrow, irritation coiling in his chest. He could already sense the inevitable. As the water flowed, a droplet escaped the rim and splashed onto the tablecloth. The tiny sound seemed deafening in the hush of the restaurant. Then it happened. The pitcher slipped ever so slightly in Naomi's grip, and a thin stream of water splashed onto Blake's cuff. It was a small accident. Harmless, really. But to Blake, it was an unforgivable offense. He shot to his feet, the chair legs scraping loudly against the polished floor. "Are you kidding me?" His voice sliced through the soft murmur of conversation like a blade. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Silverware clinked against porcelain as diners turned to witness the scene. Naomi froze, her face draining of color. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, placing the pitcher back on the tray with shaky hands. Blake extended his arm and examined the cuff of his $800 shirt, as if it had been contaminated with acid. "Sorry," he laughed bitterly. "Do you even understand where you are? This isn't some greasy diner on the corner. This is the Hudson Manor, my restaurant, and you just ruined the experience with your clumsiness." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She lowered her gaze, her hands instinctively cradling her swollen belly. Blake's lips curled into a sneer. "Look at you," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "A pregnant whale who can't even pour water properly. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? Probably more than you'll make in your entire pathetic career." A collective gasp swept across the room. An older woman at a nearby table shook her head in disgust. The maitre d', pale and rigid, shifted uncomfortably by the bar but dared not intervene. Naomi bit her lower lip. One tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. Still, she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that pride didn't pay bills. "Get out of my sight," Blake barked, "before you make me lose my appetite." The tray rattled as she picked it up. Her legs trembled as Ela retreated toward the kitchen, her head bowed in shame. The silence lingered even after the kitchen door swung shut behind her. Blake exhaló longamente, ajustando os puños novamente. "Unbelievable," murmuró, sentándose. The restaurant resumed its cautious hum, though the tension clung to the air like smoke. The waiter refilled his wine without meeting his eyes. Blake didn't notice. He was too busy composing a scathing email to the restaurant manager for hiring incompetent and unprofessional staff. Later that night, Blake left the Hudson Manor, stepping into the cool night air without a backward glance. His car, a sleek black Mercedes, glided away from the curb as the city lights reflected off its polished surface. For him, the incident was already forgotten. What he didn't know, what he would only discover much later, was that Naomi Fletcher collapsed behind the kitchen door less than an hour after his outburst. Her co-workers rushed to her side as she clutched her stomach, gasping in pain. An ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens screaming against the night as paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher. She whispered through labored breaths, "My baby. Please save my baby." The ambulance door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped toward Boston General Hospital, its red lights painting the street in streaks of crimson. Meanwhile, Blake Callahan slept soundly in his penthouse, oblivious to the nightmare he had set in motion. But fate, as it always does, was already tightening its grip around his perfect, untouchable world. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights filled the hospital corridor. Nurses moved briskly through the halls, their footsteps tapping against the cold tile floor. In room 314, Naomi Fletcher lay motionless on the bed, her face pale and waxy. Her breaths were shallow, her body depleted from the strain of the night before. Electrodes were attached to her chest, monitoring every fragile heartbeat. A fetal monitor beeped beside her, tracking the life within her that had so nearly been extinguished. The doctor stood at the foot of the bed, studying the charts with a furrowed brow. "We were lucky," he said softly, glancing at the nurse beside him. The baby's heart rate stabilized after the medication. But if she'd arrived 10 minutes later, the nurse shook her head, lips pressed into a grim line. Stress-induced complications in the 8th month, poor woman. She tucked the blanket around Naomi's motionless form, and she was working on her feet until she collapsed. Can you believe that? The doctor didn't respond. He'd seen too many cases like this. Women pushing themselves to the limit because life gave them no other option. But something about Naomi's case felt different. Maybe it was the deep frown etched into her forehead even in unconsciousness, as if she were still bracing for an unseen blow. Meanwhile, across the city, Blake Callahan was already halfway through his morning routine. He sat at the marble island in his penthouse, scrolling through his tablet as his assistant, Sarah, went through his schedule. Board meeting at 10, call with the New York investors at noon, and a site visit at the new waterfront location at 3, Sarah recited. She hesitated before adding, and, there was a call from Boston General Hospital. Blake barely looked up. A hospital, why? They mentioned Naomi Fletcher, the waitress from the Hudson Manor. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Apparently, she collapsed last night after her shift. She's in critical condition. Blake paused, his eyes narrowing. Why would they call me? Well, they said her emergency contact was unavailable, and for some reason, your name was listed as the next person to notify. Blake's brows knit together. That doesn't make sense. I don't know the woman. That's what I thought too, Sarah admitted. But the doctor said we should inform you. It sounded urgent. Blake exhaled through his nose and set his tablet down. Fine. Get the car. The Mercedes cut through morning traffic, weaving between taxis and delivery vans as the driver headed toward the hospital. Blake stared out the window, irritation simmering just beneath the surface. Naomi Fletcher was nothing more than an employee, a clumsy, forgettable one at that. The fact that the hospital contacted him felt like an administrative mistake, an inconvenience on an already busy day. When they arrived, the nurse at the reception desk directed him to room 314. The antiseptic smell of the hospital pricked his nostrils as he walked down the hallway. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, drawing glances from nurses and visitors alike. He ignored them, his mind already preparing the curt conversation he'd have with the doctor about the mix-up. But when he stepped into the room, his breath caught in his throat. Naomi lay still against the crisp sheets, her skin nearly translucent. Her lips, usually rosy with exertion from the bustling restaurant, were pale. Tubes ran from her arms, connecting her to bags of saline and medication. The monitor beside her bed beeped in steady, mechanical rhythm. Blake cleared his throat. I'm Blake Callahan. Someone called me about her. The doctor approached, offering a tight nod. Yes, Mr. Callahan. Thank you for coming. Miss Fletcher suffered a stress-induced placental abruption. We managed to stabilize her and the baby, but it was close. Blake's jaw tightened. Why call me? I'm not family. The doctor hesitated. According to the records, Naomi Fletcher is the daughter of Donovan Hayes. The name hit Blake like a punch to the chest. Donovan Hayes, the man who'd once saved him from financial ruin. The mentor who'd taught him that relationships were the heart of any business. The only person who'd believed in him when every bank had slammed the door in his face. Blake's vision blurred for a moment. He gripped the metal railing at the foot of the bed to steady himself. His mind raced through fragmented memories. Donovan's booming laugh. His warm advice. The handshake that had sealed the deal that changed Blake's life. This is Donovan's daughter. His voice cracked with disbelief. The doctor nodded. Yes, she listed no living relatives, but Donovan Hayes is recorded as her father. We assumed you knew her, given your past association with Mr. Hayes. Blake's gaze shifted to Naomi. The last time El havia visto Donovan for no funeral. Ha anos, he'd promised, standing over the casket, that he'd honor the man's legacy. Yet here he was, having publicly humiliated Donovan's daughter, driving her to the brink of tragedy. The weight of it settled on his chest like a slab of stone. Naomi stirred. Her eyelids fluttered and her lips parted as if grasping for air. Slowly, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, but then locking on Blake. Recognition dawned. Her pupils contracted, and her expression hardened despite her weakness. You, she whispered. Blake took a step closer. I didn't know. Her voice, though weak, was sharp as glass. My father believed in you. He helped you. She drew a shaky breath. He would have been ashamed of what you did to me. Blake froze. The beeping of the monitors quickened slightly as Naomi turned her face away from him. Blake opened his mouth to respond, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. He left the room moments later, his pulse hammering in his ears. The elevator ride to the lobby felt endless, the sterile lights harsh and unrelenting. When the doors finally opened, Blake stepped onto the marble floor and inhaled deeply. He looked down at his reflection in the polished surface, and for the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. Blake Callahan sat stiffly in the back of his Mercedes as the car navigated through the busy streets of Boston. The city blurred past the tinted windows. Restaurants, cafes, boutiques bustling with people living their ordinary lives. Blake didn't see any of it. His mind was caught in a relentless loop. Trapped in the sterile hospital room, in Naomi Fletcher's hoarse, broken voice, and the weight of a name he hadn't heard in years. Donovan Hayes, the name echoed in his skull like a bell-tolling judgment. The man who had once saved him from complete financial ruin. The man who'd given him a chance when everyone else turned their backs. The man who had believed in him. Blake rubbed his temples, the memory vivid. Despite the years, he could still picture Donovan sitting across from him in that tiny, worn-down office with its squeaky chairs and cluttered desk. He'd been desperate then, practically begging for help, and Donovan had smiled, extended a hand and said, "Success is about people, Blake. Never forget that." And now he'd stood in a crowded restaurant and humiliated that man's daughter. Blake closed his eyes and leaned back against the headrest. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, unfamiliar and suffocating. He wasn't a man who lost sleep over people's opinions. He believed kindness was a weakness, but Naomi's words had struck deep, exposing the cracks he'd been ignoring for years. My father would have been ashamed of you. The car slowed for a red light. Blake opened his eyes and caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him looked unfamiliar, jaw clenched, brows furrowed, eyes clouded with something dangerously close to regret. The arrogance, the certainty that had defined him for so long, had vanished. "Take me to the old office," he said suddenly. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't question the order. The car veered left, away from the financial district, toward the quieter side of the city. When they arrived, Blake stepped out and stood for a moment, taking in the small brick building that had once housed his dreams. The brass plaque by the door read, "Hayes and Callahan Investments." He hadn't been here in years. His empire had long since outgrown the modest office, but he'd kept it for nostalgia, or maybe to honor the man who'd helped him build it. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The interior smelled of stale coffee and old leather. Desks sat abandoned, their surfaces layered with dust. Blake walked through the dimly lit space until he reached a familiar door with a frosted glass panel. Donovan Hayes, senior partner. The sight of the name punched the air from his lungs. He hesitated, then turned the knob. The office was exactly as he remembered. The sturdy oak desk, the leather chair, worn from years of use, the shelves packed with books on finance, leadership, and human nature. He trailed a finger along the edge of the desk, recalling the countless hours he'd spent here learning from Donovan. On the corner of the desk sat a photograph in a cracked frame. Donovan, grinning broadly, with a little girl perched on his lap. Her blonde curls glinted in the sunlight, and her eyes sparkled with pure, unguarded joy. Naomi. Blake's throat tightened. He opened the desk drawers and rifled through the neatly stacked papers. Old contracts, faded receipts, handwritten notes. In the bottom drawer, he found a single sheet of paper folded in half. Unfolding it, he immediately recognized Donovan's handwriting. Blake, never forget, success is built on relationships. If you ever lose your way, stop and look at the people around you. They're the foundation, not the numbers. Blake squeezed the paper until his knuckles turned white. His chest burned with shame. Donovan had entrusted him with a lesson about humanity, about integrity, and he'd thrown it away. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and answered without checking the screen. "Mr. Callahan, it's Sarah," his assistant said, her voice tight. "The hospital called. Naomi Fletcher's condition has worsened. The baby is in distress." Blake's heart stopped. "I'm on my way," he said, already racing toward the door. The drive to Boston General felt endless. Traffic lights conspired against them, every stop intensifying the sense of helplessness clawing at his chest. When they finally arrived, Blake didn't wait for the car to stop fully. He jumped out and sprinted toward the entrance. Upstairs, the obstetrics IQ was a stark contrast to his world of polished marble and muted jazz. The walls were painted a soothing blue, but the atmosphere crackled with tension. The doctor who'd spoken to him earlier stood by the nurse's station. "Mr. Callahan," he said with a grave nod. "Miss Fletcher's condition has deteriorated. The stress from last night triggered complications. We managed to stabilize her for now. But the baby," Blake's pulse roared in his ears. "The baby. The heart rate has dropped. If it doesn't improve soon, we may need to perform an emergency delivery." Blake's legs felt like lead. He rubbed his hands down his face and forced himself to stay calm. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She's conscious but exhausted. Be gentle." Blake stepped into the room. Naomi lay against the pillows, her skin even paler than before. Her hair clung to her forehead, and the monitor beside her bed beeped in a distressingly irregular rhythm. When her eyes opened and met his, they hardened instantly. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard what happened," Blake said, taking a cautious step closer. "I came to see if you needed anything." She let out a humorless laugh that dissolved into a wince. "Yeah, because you care so much about your employees, right? Or are you here to clean up your public image?" Blake felt the sting of her words but didn't retreat. "I know you don't believe me and I don't blame you. I acted like a monster that night. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." Her gaze shifted toward the fetal monitor. "If my baby dies..." "He won't," Blake said, gripping the metal railing at the foot of the bed. "I promise you, I'll make sure the doctors do everything possible to save him." Naomi closed her eyes. The effort of speaking had drained her. Blake lingered a moment longer, then turned toward the door. The doctor met him in the hall. "Her blood pressure's climbing again," the doctor said, voice tight. "The stress is dangerous." Blake stared at the linoleum floor for a long moment. "Do whatever it takes to save that baby," he said. The doctor nodded and hurried away. Blake leaned against the wall, his heart racing. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. But here, in this sterile corridor, everything was hanging by a thread, and for the first time in years, Blake Callahan realized there was something he couldn't control, and it terrified him. Blake Callahan stood outside the hospital, the cold air biting through his coat. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, but no amount of warmth could ease the icy weight in his chest. The events of the past 24 hours swirled in his mind, disjointed and relentless. The image of Naomi, pale and exhausted in that hospital bed, haunted him. Her words echoed like a relentless mantra. "My father would have been ashamed of you." He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, the sharp scent of antiseptic still clinging to his nostrils. Donovan Hayes, the man who'd been more of a father to him than his own, had trusted him. Donovan had believed that Blake could build something remarkable, not just through profit, but through people. And Blake had repaid that belief by humiliating the man's daughter in front of a crowded restaurant. He rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the crushing sense of guilt. Guilt wasn't a familiar feeling. For years, he'd dismissed it as an emotion for the weak. He was a businessman, after all. Decisions were made with logic, not sentiment. People were assets or liabilities. Efficiency ruled everything. But as he stood there in the hospital parking lot, those beliefs felt like dry, brittle leaves disintegrating in his grasp. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another business call, another problem to solve with detached precision. Instead, it was Sarah. "Mr. Callahan," she said, voice cautious. "The media got wind of what happened last night. There are already articles circulating about you humiliating a pregnant waitress who ended up in critical condition. It's spreading fast." Blake's stomach twisted. What kind of coverage? "Brutal," she admitted. The headline on one site says, "Millionaire mogul mocks pregnant waitress. She collapses hours later." It's gaining traction on social media. People are calling for a boycott of all your restaurants. PR is working on a statement. Blake clenched his jaw. "No statement, not yet. Sir, we need to get ahead of this." "No," he said firmly. "I'll handle it." He ended the call and stared up at the hospital building. From here, room 314 was just a faintly lit square of glass against the darkening sky. Inside that room lay a woman he'd hurt, a woman who carried a baby fighting for its life because of the stress he had caused. And she was also Donovan's daughter, a living, breathing reminder of the debt he owed. Blake turned and headed for his car. The next morning, he arrived at his corporate headquarters earlier than usual. The office tower loomed against the dawn, its windows reflecting the city like cold, unfeeling mirrors. Blake strode through the lobby, ignoring the curious glances from employees who'd undoubtedly seen the headlines. In his corner office, he sat at his desk and opened a drawer. Beneath the neatly arranged pens and papers lay an old, leather-bound journal. Donovan had given it to him when they first became business partners. The first page held a handwritten inscription. "Business is about people, Blake. Never forget that. The day you do, you'll lose more than money. You'll lose yourself." Blake ran his fingers over the inked words. He had spent years dismissing that advice as naive idealism. And yet, here he was, drowning in the consequences of his neglect. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Callahan," Sarah's voice came through. Subdued. "Naomi Fletcher is online too. Should I put her through?" Blake's head snapped up. Naomi was calling him. "Yes, put her through." There was a brief crackle before Naomi's voice came through, weak but steady. "Mr. Callahan." "Naomi," Blake said, gripping the phone tightly. "How are you?" "How's the baby?" "Still fighting," she answered, her voice flat. "The doctors say the next few days are critical." Blake exhaled slowly. I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that." Silence stretched on the line. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," she said eventually. "Sorry doesn't erase the fear I felt when I collapsed, or the guilt I feel every time I hear that heart monitor speeding up when I get anxious. My baby is suffering because you couldn't control your temper." Blake swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're right. Nothing I say can undo that, but I want to try to make things right. For you, for your child, for Donovan." The mention of her father seemed to catch her off guard. When she spoke again, her voice wavered. "How dare you bring him into this? My father would have never humiliated someone the way you humiliated me." "I know," Blake said softly. "I've let him down, and I've let you down. But I haven't forgotten what he taught me. I just buried it under greed and arrogance. I'm trying to find my way back to the man your father believed I could be." Naomi didn't respond, and for a moment, Blake thought she'd hung up. But then she sighed heavily. "I don't know if I believe you." "I don't expect you to," he said. "But let me show you." Another long pause. "How?" Blake rubbed his temple, considering his next words carefully. I'm going to create a foundation in honor of your father, the Donovan Hayes Foundation. It will support single mothers like you, mothers who work hard every day and still struggle to make ends meet. No strings attached, no par stunts, just real help. Naomi scoffed faintly. Money doesn't solve everything. I know, but it can open doors that have been closed for too long. Your father did that for me when no one else would. It's time I did the same for others. Why now? She asked, suspicion lacing her tone. Blake leaned forward, elbows on his desk. Because I saw you in that hospital bed. I saw the fight in you, the strength. It reminded me of your father, and it reminded me of what he tried to teach me. Naomi inhaled shakily. I need to think about it. Take your time, Blake said. And, Naomi, I'm rooting for your baby. Truly. The line went dead. Blake set the phone down and stared out the window. The city stretched endlessly before him, gleaming towers of power and wealth, but for the first time, none of it seemed to matter. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd kept for years. Robert, he said when the man answered. I need you to set up a foundation. Name it the Donovan Hayes Foundation, and make it a priority. The next few days passed in a haze of paperwork and strategy meetings. But through it all, Blake's thoughts remained with Naomi and her unborn child. He visited the hospital again one evening, slipping into the maternity ward unnoticed. Through the window of room 314, he saw Naomi asleep, her hand resting protectively on her belly. The fetal monitor beeped softly, signaling life. Blake pressed a hand to the cool glass. Hang in there, little one, he whispered. Your mom's strong, and this time, I won't let her down. Blake Callahan sat in his dimly lit office long after his staff had left for the day. The city skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, glittering like a sea of restless stars. His eyes, however, weren't on the view. They were fixed on the worn leather journal in front of him. Donovan Hayes' words stared back at him. Business is about people. Never forget that. He ran a finger over the faded ink, memories clawing their way to the surface. The day Donovan had given him that journal, Blake had been a different man. Young, ambitious, driven, but not yet consumed by greed and superiority. He remembered sitting across from his mentor in that tiny office, listening as Donovan explained that success wasn't about crushing the competition, but about building something that endured, and that endurance came from the people you lifted, not those you stepped on. Somewhere along the way, Blake had stopped listening. He closed the journal with a sigh and leaned back in his chair. The weight of Naomi's voice haunted him still. My father would have been ashamed of you. Those words carried more force than a punch to the gut. They had unraveled years of carefully constructed armor, exposing a core he'd long pretended no longer existed. The shrill ring of his phone jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering. Callahan, he said, voice gruff. Mr. Callahan, this is Dr. Morris from Boston General. Blake sat up. Is Naomi okay, the baby? Ms. Fletcher is stable? But we had to move her to intensive monitoring. The baby's heart rate dipped again earlier today. We've stabilized it, but we're on high alert. I thought you might want to know. Blake's throat went dry. Yeah, thanks for calling. He hung up and immediately grabbed his coat. The hospital was quieter at night, the usual daytime hustle replaced by muted conversations and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. When he reached Naomi's room, he stood at the window, peering in. She was awake, sitting propped against the pillows. Her face was pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, as if sheer willpower alone could shield her child from harm. He knocked lightly on the doorframe and stepped in. Naomi's eyes narrowed when she saw him. Why are you here? Her voice was thin but sharp. Blake hesitated. I heard things got worse. I wanted to check on you. She let out a bitter laugh. Why, guilt still gnawing at you? Or are you hoping for a good PR moment? He winced, but didn't back away. I don't blame you for hating me. I hate me too right now. Her expression shifted, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by cold indifference. Yeah, well, hate won't save my baby. Blake moved closer, stopping at the edge of the bed. I know, and I know that money can't undo what I did. but I also know I can help. Not just with this foundation I'm starting, but with you, with whatever you need. Naomi's fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, Blake said softly. It's repentance. I owe it to your father. To you. Naomi's jaw tightened. My father trusted you. He believed you were different. But you're just like all the others. Arrogant. Cruel. Pretending to care when it benefits you. Blake dropped his gaze. You're right. I became that man. But I don't want to be him anymore. Silence stretched between them. Thick with unspoken pain, the monitor beside the bed emitted a sharp, irregular beep. Naomi tensed, breathing faster as panic flickered in her eyes. Blake instinctively reached for her hand. Hey, he said softly. Breathe. Slow. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. Her chest heaved as she tried to follow his instructions. Blake kept his grip firm but gentle, grounding her. That's it, he whispered. You're strong. You've got this. After a few agonizing minutes, the monitor stabilized, and Naomi sagged against the pillows. That happens more often now, she said, voice trembling. The doctors say it's the stress. Blake's heart clenched. Then I'm the last person who should be here, he said, releasing her hand and stepping back. Probably, she agreed, though the hostility in her voice softened just a fraction. But you helped me calm down, so thanks, I guess. Blake nodded and turned toward the door. Wait, she called out as he reached the threshold. He stopped and faced her. The foundation, she said, hesitant. You're really doing it. Yes, Blake answered. The paperwork's already in motion. It'll focus on helping single mothers with childcare, housing, education, no press releases, no big announcements, just help. Naomi chewed her lip. Why single mothers? Because of you, he said simply. Because when I saw you that night, working while pregnant, I realized how hard it must be for women in your position, and I know your father would have done something about it. She looked down, her thumb brushing absent-mindedly across her belly. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt less hostile. Blake didn't wait for her response. He gave a small nod and left the room, the quiet beep, beep, beep of the fetal monitor trailing behind him. Outside, he leaned against the corridor wall and exhaled shakily. He'd faced hostile boardrooms, aggressive investors, and cutthroat competitors. But standing in that room with Naomi Fletcher had been more challenging than any deal he'd ever closed. As he walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Sir, we've received over 1,000 emails since this morning. People are outraged. Some customers say they'll never eat at our restaurants again. Reporters are camped outside the flagship location. It's bad. Let them be outraged, Blake said, stepping out into the cold night air. I'm done running from this. But the PR team, tell them not to issue any statements yet, he interrupted. And find me a meeting with the best social worker in Boston. Someone who actually understands what single mothers go through. Sarah hesitated. Understood, sir. Blake ended the call and slipped the phone into his coat pocket. He stared up at the hospital windows. For years, he'd lived by one rule: dominate or be dominated. Now, the only thing dominating him was the fear of letting down the only people who still mattered. He turned and walked toward his car, but his thoughts remained in room 314, with Naomi, with the baby fighting for its life, and with Donovan Hayes, whose voice seemed to whisper from the depths of his memory. Never forget, it's the people who matter. The sun was just beginning to rise when Blake Callahan arrived at the office. The morning sky was painted in muted shades of pink and gray, a soft contrast to the sharp, sterile glow of the city's skyscrapers. He stepped out of the car and into the brisk air, the weight of his sleepless night still clinging to his shoulders. His mind had been running in endless loops. Naomi's exhausted eyes, the fetal monitor's frantic beeps, the ghost of Donovan's voice whispering about the importance of people. Inside, the lobby was nearly empty except for a janitor pushing a mop across the marble floor. The man nodded politely, and Blake, for the first time in years, returned the gesture. It felt oddly unfamiliar to acknowledge someone who wasn't a board member or client. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. When the doors opened again, Sarah was already at her desk. Her face pinched with tension. She held a tablet in one hand and a disposable coffee cup in the other. "Morning, sir," she greeted, voice cautious. "We've had over 3,000 more emails since last night. The media's digging into your past now. They found footage of the restaurant incident. It's everywhere." Blake sighed and rubbed his temples. "Of course they did. Any news from the hospital?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing new. The doctors said they'd call if there was any change." Blake's heart gave a painful lurch. The thought of that tiny, unborn child fighting for survival while Naomi lay in that sterile room made his chest tighten. He gestured toward the conference room. "Come on, we've got work to do." Inside the glass-walled room, he spread several documents across the polished table. At the center was the charter for the Donovan Hayes Foundation. Blake sat down and tapped the papers. "We move forward with this. No delays. I want our first community program up and running within the month." Sarah adjusted her glasses. "That's ambitious, sir. We haven't even finalized the board members." "Then finalize it," Blake said. "Start with people who understand struggle. Single mothers, teachers, nurses. I don't want a board full of corporate sharks." He hesitated. "And put Naomi Fletcher's name on the list." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "Naomi Fletcher? The woman from the restaurant?" "Yes," Blake said firmly. "She's the reason we're doing this, and she deserves a seat at the table." Sarah scribbled on her notepad, but said nothing more. By midday, the foundation's paperwork was submitted, and Blake was en route to the hospital. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit him the moment he entered the IQ floor. Nurses passed by in quiet efficiency, their expressions professional and distant. Blake made his way to room 314, pausing at the doorway. Naomi was awake, staring out the window. Her hand rested on her belly, fingers tracing slow, nervous circles. The fetal monitor beeped steadily now, a reassuring rhythm. Blake knocked softly. She turned her head, and her expression hardened the moment she recognized him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice flat. "I came to check on you," he said. "And the baby?" Her eyes narrowed. "Why do you care?" Blake stepped inside, keeping his distance. "Because your father once cared about me when I didn't deserve it. And because I care now, more than I thought possible." Naomi gave a hollow laugh. "You humiliated me in front of a restaurant full of people. Do you have any idea how that felt? And now you expect me to believe you care?" Blake winced but didn't look away. "No, I don't expect you to believe me. I know I have to prove it." Naomi shifted uncomfortably in the bed. Wincing as a contraction rippled through her, Blake instinctively moved forward, but she held up a hand. "I'm fine," she muttered. "Just stress. The doctors say if I can stay calm, the baby has a better chance." Her eyes darkened. "Easier said than done, considering everything." Blake hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I started the foundation," he said softly. Naomi's forehead creased. "What foundation?" "The Donovan Hayes Foundation," he answered. "Dedicated to helping single mothers, childcare assistance, job training, housing support, all in your father's name." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering in her eyes before skepticism returned. "Why?" "Because it's what he would have done," Blake said. "And because I needed to remember who he taught me to be." Naomi shook her head slowly. "You think money fixes everything?" "No," Blake said, his voice low but steady. "I think action does. I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't either if I were you. But your father gave me a second chance when I was at rock bottom. I want to honor that by helping others." Naomi remained silent, her gaze drifting to the window again. The sky was overcast now, thick clouds smothering the afternoon sun. Blake turned to leave, feeling the conversation had hit a dead end. "Wait," she said suddenly. He stopped, looking over his shoulder. "You're really doing this?" she asked. "The foundation, for real?" "Yes," Blake said. "And I want you to be on the board. I want your voice to guide the decisions we make. You know better than anyone what it's like to be in that position." Naomi blinked, clearly thrown off balance. "Me, on the board? I'm just a waitress. I don't know anything about running a charity." Blake smiled faintly. "Neither did I when I started in business. Your father taught me, maybe. Maybe I can pass some of that along to you." Her expression softened. "Just a fraction." "I'll think about it," she whispered. "That's all I ask." Blake left the room, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He didn't know if Naomi would ever trust him, but for the first time, He felt like he was on the right path. The next morning, headlines flooded the internet. Millionaire Blake Callahan announces foundation for single mothers in honor of former mentor. The comments were mixed. Some praised the initiative. Others accused him of trying to buy redemption. Blake ignored them all. He knew the truth. This wasn't about redemption. It was about honoring a promise he'd made long ago. Late that afternoon, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He opened it. "I don't trust you yet, but I'm willing to see if you're serious. Naomi." Blake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was just a text, just a few words. But to him, it felt like the first crack of light breaking through a very long, very dark night. Blake Callahan sat at his desk, staring at the text message from Naomi Fletcher. The words seemed simple enough, but to him, they carried the weight of a lifetime. "I don't trust you yet, but I'm willing to see if you're serious." It was more than he'd expected, after what he'd done. He wouldn't have blamed her if she'd sworn never to speak to him again, but she'd left a door cracked open, and Blake was determined to step through it with the caution of a man navigating a minefield. He couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could shape a better future. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sarah. "Mr. Callahan, reporters have started camping outside the hospital. They've gotten wind of the connection between you and Naomi Fletcher." Blake clenched his jaw. "Are they bothering her?" "Not directly, but they're relentless. She's been under enough stress already, this isn't helping." "I'll handle it," Blake said. Standing and grabbing his coat, the drive to Boston General was tense. Outside the hospital, a cluster of journalists huddled near the entrance. Their cameras clicked the moment Blake stepped out of his car. "Mr. Callahan, is it true you humiliated a pregnant employee? Are you just starting this foundation to fix your reputation? What's your relationship with Naomi Fletcher?" Blake kept walking, ignoring the barrage of questions. Inside, the receptionist recognized him immediately and pointed toward the maternity IQ. As he approached room 314, he saw Naomi through the window. She was sitting up, scrolling through her phone with a furrowed brow. The soft glow of the monitor beside her cast an eerie light across her tired face. He knocked gently and stepped inside. Naomi looked up, her expression wary. "Did you send them?" she asked. "The reporters—" "No," Blake said, pulling a chair closer but stopping just short of sitting. "But I'll get rid of them. I promise." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "The doctor said the stress is making the contractions worse. I'm trying to stay calm, but every time my phone pings with a new headline." She tossed the phone onto the blanket. "It's like I'm part of some sick soap opera now." Blake rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll call in some favors. Make them back off." "And then what?" Naomi asked, folding her arms protectively around her belly. "They'll just find another angle. The Millionaire and the Waitress. Sounds like a bad romance novel." Blake gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, except there's no romance here, just regret." Naomi studied him for a moment. "Why did you become like this? So cold?" Blake shifted in his chair, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. "I guess success does that to some people. I started out hungry, wanting to prove myself, and when you're climbing, you focus on the next step, the next win. Eventually, I stopped seeing the people holding the ladder steady, like my father," Naomi said softly. "Yeah," Blake admitted, voice thick. "Like Donovan, he gave me a chance when no one else would, and I forgot what that meant." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady beep of the monitor. Naomi's hand absent-mindedly rubbed her stomach, her gaze distant. Blake shifted forward. "The foundation isn't a stunt, Naomi, I swear. I want it to be something real, something that actually helps people like you. People like me," she repeated, eyebrow arched. "I mean, single mothers, women who work long hours for low pay while trying to prepare for a child, people who don't have safety nets, people who get overlooked, like you did that night." Naomi's jaw tightened. "You didn't just overlook me, Blake. You destroyed me. I was humiliated in front of strangers. I collapsed, thinking I might lose my baby. Do you have any idea what that fear feels like?" He didn't, and the realization hollowed him out. "No," Blake said softly. "I don't, but I want to help make sure no one else has to go through that." Naomi turned her face toward the window. Her reflection looked back at her, tired and uncertain. I read about the foundation this morning, she said eventually. Online, people are divided. Half think it's a genuine effort. Half think it's just you trying to salvage your reputation. Blake exhaled slowly. I'm not surprised. I deserve that skepticism. So why keep going? Naomi asked. Why not just walk away? Because of your dad, Blake said without hesitation. And because of you. If I can help make your life, and the lives of women like you, a little easier, then maybe I can look in the mirror again without hating what I see. Naomi closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The monitor quickened for a moment, then evened out again. When she opened them, her expression was softer. I'm not saying I trust you, she murmured. But I guess I'll go to a foundation meeting when I'm out of here, just to see what you're really doing. Blake sat straighter. I'd like that. Don't get your hopes up, she warned. Too late, Blake said with a faint smile as he stood to leave. The doctor walked in with a clipboard. His expression was serious. Ms. Fletcher, your blood pressure is still elevated, and the baby's heart rate has dipped again, he said. If this continues, we might have to consider an early delivery. Naomi's eyes widened with fear. But I'm only 8 months, it's too soon. We'll monitor closely, the doctor assured her. Right now, rest is critical. No stress. Blake squeezed the back of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. The gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. If Naomi lost that baby, he didn't know how he'd live with himself. After the doctor left, Naomi slumped against the pillows. Her breath came faster, shallow and panicked. Hey, Blake said, stepping closer. Look at me. Her eyes met his. You and that baby are fighters. I saw it that night in the restaurant, even if I was too much of an idiot to recognize it then. You're strong, and you're not alone. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Just breathe, Blake said, voice steady. I've got you. Her breath slowed, matching the rhythm he set. After a few minutes, the monitor returned to a normal pace. Blake stayed at her bedside until she drifted into an uneasy sleep. Only then did he leave, his heart heavy with the weight of the unknown. As he walked down the hallway, he made a decision. Naomi's safety and her baby's life came first, no matter what it cost him. Outside, reporters still hovered near the entrance, cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Blake stopped in front of them, adjusted his tie, and faced the crowd. I'm Blake Callahan, he announced, and I have something to say. The reporters surged forward, microphones raised. This foundation isn't about PR. It's about righting a wrong. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and now I'm dedicating my resources to help others like her. If you want to blame me, fine. But leave Naomi Fletcher alone. She's fighting for her child's life. Give her the peace she deserves. The reporters fired questions at him, but Blake turned and walked away. He didn't know if his words would make a difference, but for the first time in years, he'd spoken not as a businessman, but as a human being. Blake Callahan stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the cool water dripping from his fingertips. The hotel suite was silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioner. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and unfamiliar. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper, his jaw perpetually clenched. He was used to seeing confidence in those eyes, arrogant, unshakable confidence. Now, all he saw was doubt. He dried his hands with a towel and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled beneath him, glittering and vast. Normally, this view fueled his ego. He would stand here, drink in hand, and think, I built this, all of it. But tonight, the sight left him cold. Naomi was still in the hospital. Her baby's heart rate was still unstable, and he was the reason behind that stress. He rubbed his face with both hands. How had it come to this? He'd spent years building his empire, convincing himself that his success justified everything, his coldness, his arrogance, his ruthlessness. And in one night, with a cruel insult and an overturned water pitcher, he'd shattered everything. The words he'd said to Naomi echoed in his skull. A pregnant whale who can't even pour water properly. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block the memory, but it clung to him, merciless and sharp. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He checked the screen. Sarah, he answered with a heavy sigh. Yeah, Mr. Callahan, we've got a situation, Sarah said. There's a video circulating on social media from that night at the Hudson Manor. Blake's stomach dropped. What video? Security footage. Someone leaked it. The whole scene. Your words. Her reaction. It's everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, even national news sites are running it. People are furious. Blake sank onto the edge of the bed, his free hand gripping his knee. How bad is it? Bad, Sarah said. We're losing reservations across all restaurants. Protests are being organized in front of multiple locations and, well, people are calling you a monster. Blake let out a humorless laugh. Maybe they're right. What do you want me to do? Sarah asked. Nothing, Blake said after a moment. Let them be angry. They have every right to be. He hung up and tossed the phone aside. The room seemed to shrink around him. The anger, the judgment, the public outrage. It was all justified. For years, he'd prided himself on his lack of concern for public opinion. Now, he realized that what he'd dismissed as noise was, in reality, the collective voice of people who saw what he had refused to see, that he'd become a man his mentor would have despised. The next morning, Blake drove straight to the hospital. The protests had spread here too. Outside the main entrance, a crowd had gathered with signs bearing slogans like, "Justice for Naomi," and "Stop supporting bullies." He parked in a side lot and took the back elevator to the ICU floor. When he reached room 314, Naomi was sitting up in bed, scrolling through her phone with an expression of disbelief. "Did you see it?" she asked the moment he stepped inside. Blake didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yeah, I saw it. It's everywhere," she said, voice trembling. "I've gotten messages from strangers. People saying they're sorry for what happened. People offering to help. It's overwhelming." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm so sorry, Naomi. I never wanted this kind of attention on you." Her eyes shifted to the window. "You know what's weird?" she said softly. "A part of me is glad they saw it. For so long I thought maybe I was overreacting, that maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt in the moment. But seeing it there, from the outside, it was even worse." Blake lowered his gaze. "I don't have an excuse. I was cruel. I treated you like you were less than human, and I hate myself for it." Naomi didn't respond immediately. Her hand moved absently over her belly, her expression unreadable. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, a fragile reminder of the life still fighting to survive. After a long silence, she spoke. "The foundation. Is it real?" "Yes," Blake said. "We filed the paperwork. We have the first board meeting scheduled for next week. And your name is on the list, just like I said it would be." Naomi's brows lifted slightly. "You really want me on that board?" "You're the reason it exists," Blake said. "No one else can guide it the way you can." Naomi exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I'm ready to sit at a table with you." "I understand," Blake said. "But when you're ready, the seat is yours." Her phone buzzed on the bed. She picked it up and frowned at the screen. "What is it?" Blake asked. "It's my landlord," she said. "He saw the video. He says he doesn't want the attention that comes with me living in his building. He's giving me 30 days to leave." Blake's jaw tightened. "That's illegal." "Yeah, well, try convincing him of that," Naomi muttered. "I can get you a place," Blake said immediately. She shot him a sharp glare. "No. Naomi, you're 8 months pregnant. You don't need this kind of stress right now." "I don't want your money," she snapped. "It's not charity," Blake said. "It's what your father would have done for me if I'd needed it. Let me do this for you." Naomi closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to calm herself. The monitor beeped erratically for a moment, then settled again. "Fine," she said finally. "But just for the baby, not for me." "Understood," Blake said softly. That night, he arranged for an apartment in a quiet, secure building. No media, no prying neighbors. He sent Naomi the address along with a message. "The lease is in the foundation's name. No ties to me, just a safe place for you and the baby." The next morning, Sarah entered his office with a tablet in hand. "You need to see this," she said, placing it on his desk. Blake tapped the screen. A news website displayed an image of Naomi in the hospital, along with the headline, "From Humiliation to Hope, the pregnant waitress who brought down a millionaire." Blake felt a strange mixture of pride and shame. Naomi didn't want the spotlight, but her story had ignited a conversation about the mistreatment of service workers, and if that conversation came at his expense, so be it. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Naomi. The baby's heart rate dropped again. Doctors are preparing for an emergency delivery. Blake's heart stopped. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and ran for the elevator. Blake Callahan burst through the hospital entrance, his heart hammering in his chest. The cold, sterile air hit him like a wall, but he didn't slow down. His polished shoes slapped against the linoleum floor as he raced toward the maternity IQ. Every step carried the weight of dread, a suffocating fear that coiled tighter with each passing second. The elevator ride to the third floor stretched endlessly. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out and scanned the corridor. The usually calm maternity ward was now a flurry of activity. Nurses moved with purpose, their expressions tense. A doctor stood at the nurses' station, issuing rapid instructions. Blake recognized him as Dr. Morris and rushed over. "What's happening?" he demanded, breathless. The doctor's face was grim. "Miss, Fletcher's baby's heart rate dropped dangerously low. We've been monitoring intermittent decelerations for days, but this time it didn't recover. We're prepping her for an emergency C-section." Blake's mouth went dry. "Is the baby going to be okay?" "We'll do everything we can," Dr. Morris said. "But the baby's lungs might not be fully developed. There are risks." Blake ran a hand through his hair. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "Only for a minute. She's already sedated and being wheeled into the OR." Blake followed the doctor down the hallway, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the quiet space. At the end of the corridor, Naomi lay on a gurney. Her skin was pale and her breathing shallow. An IV snaked from her arm, delivering medication to keep her calm. Blake knelt beside her. "Naomi," he whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. When they found his face, they sharpened slightly. "The baby," she whispered. "They're going to deliver the baby now," Blake said, his throat tightening. "The doctors will do everything they can." Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. "I'm scared." Blake reached for her hand without thinking. "I know," he said, "but you're strong. You're the strongest person I know." Her fingers squeezed his weakly. "If something happens to me, take care of him. Please." Blake swallowed hard. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said, forcing conviction into his voice. "You're going to come through this, and your baby is going to come through it too, I promise." Her eyes fluttered shut. The orderlies moved in, wheeling her toward the operating room. Blake stood there, frozen as the doors swung shut behind her. The waiting room was a blur of noise and stillness. Blake paced, his thoughts racing. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it seemed. The soft hum of vending machines and the distant sound of a nurse's laughter down the hall felt obscenely normal given the life-or-death battle happening just beyond those double doors. He sat down, then stood again, raking a hand through his hair. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. The only thing that mattered now was behind that door. The memory of Donovan Hayes surfaced unbidden. He saw Donovan's warm smile, heard his deep, reassuring voice. "Life will test you." "Blake, the question is whether you'll rise to meet it or run from it." He had spent years running. From responsibility, from vulnerability, from genuine human connection. But not now. This was a test he couldn't afford to fail. The doors to the operating room finally swung open. Dr. Morris emerged. Pulling off his surgical mask, his face revealed nothing. Blake rushed to meet him. "Is she okay, the baby?" The doctor sighed. "We delivered the baby. He's a boy. We had to intubate him immediately. His lungs are underdeveloped, but he's stable for now. We're moving him to the neonatal ICU. And Naomi," Blake's heart felt like it might stop. "She lost a lot of blood. We're giving her transfusions. She's unconscious but stable. The next 24 hours are critical." Blake closed his eyes, relief and fear crashing into him simultaneously. "Can I see them?" "The baby is in the NICU," Dr. Morris said. "You can see him through the observation window. Naomi will be moved to recovery soon." Blake followed the doctor down the hallway. The NICU was a stark, sterile environment, filled with softly beeping monitors and tiny incubators. Dr. Morris pointed toward one of the glass enclosures. Blake approached and peered inside. The baby was impossibly small. His chest rose and fell with visible effort, the ventilator tube taped to his delicate mouth. Wires attached to monitors tracked his heart rate and oxygen levels. His skin was pink but almost translucent. His tiny fists clenched as though already bracing for the fight ahead. Blake pressed a hand to the glass. "Hey, little guy," he murmured. "You don't know me yet, but I swear to you, I'm going to be here, every step of the way." Tears burned his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He had no right to hide from this moment. He stayed there for nearly an hour, watching the baby's chest rise and fall in labored, mechanical rhythm. When he finally stepped away, he returned to the waiting area just in time to see Naomi being wheeled into recovery. Her face was pale, her hair plastered to her forehead. An oxygen tube ran beneath her nose, and her breathing was slow but steady. Blake sat beside her bed and took her hand. "You did it," he whispered. "He's here, he's beautiful, and he's fighting. Just like you." The hours crawled by. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped steadily. Blake didn't move from her side. Around dawn, Naomi stirred, her eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head slightly toward him. "Blake?" Her voice was rough and barely audible. "I'm here," he said, leaning forward. "The baby. He's okay," Blake said. "He's tiny and he needs some help breathing, but he's fighting, just like his mom." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. "I need to see him." "You will," Blake promised. "As soon as you're strong enough." Naomi squeezed his hand. "Thank you for staying." "I'm not going anywhere," Blake said softly. As the first light of morning spilled through the hospital windows, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or profits or public perception. He was thinking about a tiny boy in an incubator, about a woman who'd stood up to him with more courage than anyone he'd ever met, and about the promise he'd made to himself, to be better, not just for them, but for the memory of the man who'd taught him that real success came from the heart. Blake Callahan sat beside Naomi's hospital bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. The room was dim, the only light coming from the monitors beside her. The rhythmic beep of her heart monitor mixed with the faint hum of the machines down the hall. Outside, the city stirred to life. But here, time had slowed to a crawl. Naomi was still asleep. The sedation kept her body calm as it recovered from the surgery. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, and her hair clung in damp strands to her forehead. Every few minutes, Blake would check the screen beside her bed, even though he didn't understand most of the numbers. He only knew one thing: steady meant safe. He reached for a damp cloth on the tray and gently dabbed her forehead. The woman who had faced him with unwavering defiance just days ago now lay here, vulnerable and fragile. And yet, he suspected, the fire that had kept her going through 8 months of hardship still burned beneath the surface. The door opened softly, and a nurse stepped in. She glanced at Naomi before turning to Blake. "She's stable," the nurse whispered. "Would you like me to show you to the NICU? The baby's vitals have improved slightly." Blake's chest tightened. He cast one more glance at Naomi, then stood. "Yeah," he said. "Please." The walk to the NICU was silent except for the faint squeak of the nurse's shoes against the polished floor. When they reached the observation window, the nurse pointed to the third incubator from the left. "There he is," she said, smiling softly. Blake stepped closer, pressing his palms against the glass. The baby was still impossibly small, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. The ventilator remained, along with a thin tube taped to the side of his face. Electrodes tracked his heart rhythm, the jagged lines on the monitor moving in cautious, fragile patterns. "How is he really?" Blake asked. Voice low, the nurse hesitated. "He's stable for now," she said carefully. "But premature babies are unpredictable. The next 72 hours are critical. His lungs are underdeveloped, and we're watching for signs of infection." Blake nodded, though the weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. "What's his chance?" The nurse gave him a sympathetic look. "We don't like to give odds at this stage, but he's a fighter, Mr. Callahan. He's already come this far." Blake swallowed the lump in his throat and leaned closer to the glass. "Yeah," he whispered, "just like his mom." The baby's tiny fingers twitched, and Blake found himself holding his breath. He was used to controlling outcomes, bending circumstances to his will. But here, all he could do was stand and hope. "Has Naomi seen him yet?" he asked. Not yet, the nurse said. We wanted to wait until she was stronger. I want her to see him today, Blake said firmly. Even if it's just through the window. She needs to know he's here, that he's fighting. I'll speak to the doctor, the nurse promised. Blake stayed there for nearly an hour, his eyes locked on the fragile life inside the incubator. He'd spent years chasing numbers and acquisitions, measuring success by profit margins and market share. Now, standing here, he realized what true value was. It wasn't in the empire he'd built. It was here, in this tiny human struggling to breathe, and in the woman who had endured so much to bring him into the world. Eventually, he forced himself to leave. He made his way back to Naomi's room and sank into the chair beside her bed. The hours blurred. Nurses came and went. He answered emails without really reading them, dismissing frantic messages from his PR team. The media firestorm swirling outside these walls no longer mattered. His focus was here. In the late afternoon, Naomi stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully. Her gaze moved around the room, disoriented at first, before landing on Blake. Hey, he said softly, leaning forward. You're awake. She blinked, trying to wet her cracked lips. Blake grabbed a cup of ice chips from the tray and held the spoon to her mouth. She accepted the ice, swallowing with difficulty. The baby, she rasped. He's in the NICU, Blake said, breathing with some help, but he's fighting just like you. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Her hand moved toward her abdomen, hesitating when she felt the absence of the baby. I need to see him, she whispered. Blake stood. Wait here. He stepped into the hall and flagged down a nurse. Within minutes, a wheelchair was brought into the room. Blake helped Naomi sit up and guided her gently into the chair. She winced but didn't complain as they made their way toward the NICU. Naomi's breathing quickened. Blake knelt beside her. Slow breaths, he said. He's okay, and he's waiting for you. When they reached the window, Naomi froze, her eyes locked on the tiny figure in the incubator. Oh my God, she breathed. Her hands flew to her mouth, and a sob escaped her. He's so small. Blake placed a hand on her shoulder. But strong, he said. Just like his mom. Naomi pressed her fingers against the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks. Hi, baby, she whispered. I'm here. Mama's here. The baby didn't respond, but his heart monitor beeped steadily on. Blake glanced at the nurse. Can she go inside? Only for a minute, the nurse said. Naomi's wheelchair was carefully guided into the NICU. Blake followed, standing behind her, as the nurse opened a small porthole on the side of the incubator. Go ahead, the nurse encouraged. Naomi reached inside with trembling fingers. She touched the baby's tiny hand with infinite care. His fingers twitched again, as though trying to grasp hers. He's holding my hand, she gasped, voice cracking. Blake blinked back tears. Yeah, he said. He knows you're here. Naomi stayed there, whispering to the baby for as long as the nurse allowed. When they finally wheeled her back to her room, she was pale and exhausted, but smiling through her tears. Back in her room, she settled into the bed and looked at Blake. I don't know what the future holds, she said softly, but that baby, he's everything to me. I know, Blake said, and I swear to you, Naomi, I'll do everything I can to help you give him the life he deserves. She didn't respond, just turned her face to the window, but as Blake sat beside her, he felt something shift between them. Not trust, not yet, but a flickering hope. Blake Callahan sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. The plastic chair beneath him creaked whenever he shifted his weight, and the hum of the vending machines filled the silence. The air smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee, a combination he'd come to associate with the sharp edge of fear. He'd been here for hours, but time had become a blur since Naomi's emergency delivery. His mind drifted back to the sight of her hand cradling the baby's fragile fingers through the incubator window. The look on her face, raw, vulnerable, and fiercely protective, was etched into his memory. He'd never witnessed a love so immediate and unyielding. And now, as he sat here, separated from her and the baby by a few floors and sterile walls, the weight of that love pressed down on him with a force he'd never known. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He pulled it out and saw Sarah's name on the screen. He let it ring twice before answering. Yeah, sir. The protesters have moved to the flagship restaurant in downtown Boston. It's bad. People are throwing eggs at the windows. There are videos all over social media. Blake rubbed his eyes. Let them throw eggs. We'll clean it up later. PR is panicking. They're demanding a statement. Tell them to wait. But just do it. Sarah? Blake said, voice tight. He hung up and tossed the phone onto the table. For years, his company had been his entire world. Now it felt like a distant, irrelevant kingdom. A nurse passed by and Blake stood quickly. "Excuse me," he called after her. "Any update on Naomi Fletcher or her baby?" The nurse hesitated, then checked the tablet she carried. "Ms. Fletcher is still stable. The baby's oxygen levels improved slightly overnight, but his condition remains critical. Dr. Morris will give you more details soon." Blake nodded, whispering a thank you before sitting back down. He stared at the coffee cup for a long moment, then stood again and made his way to the neonatal IQ. The hallway leading to the NICU was unnaturally quiet. Outside the window of the third incubator from the left, he stopped and looked in. The baby was still so tiny, his chest rising and falling with visible strain. The ventilator kept him alive, each breath a testament to his stubborn will to survive. "You're stronger than me, little guy," Blake murmured. "I've had everything handed to me, and I still screwed it up. But you're fighting with everything you've got." A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Talking to the glass won't help him breathe better, but it's a nice gesture. Blake turned. Dr. Morris stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes weary but kind. "How's he really doing?" Blake asked. The doctor exhaled slowly. "He's stable for now, which is more than we hoped for after the delivery. But these early days are crucial. We need his lungs to strengthen. If they don't, well, we have limited options." Blake's mouth went dry. "So, what do? We wait, we hope, and we minimize Naomi's stress as much as possible. She's been through more than enough already." Blake pressed a hand against the cool window. "I'll handle that part," he said softly. "Whatever it takes." Hours later, he found Naomi awake, propped against the pillows in her bed. She looked even more exhausted than before, but her eyes were alert when she saw him. "How's the baby?" she asked immediately. "Still fighting," Blake said as he sat beside her. "The doctors say his oxygen levels went up a little last night." Naomi sagged with relief. "Thank God." She shifted uncomfortably and winced. "Do you want me to call the nurse?" Blake asked. "No," she said. "I'm just sore and worried. I hate being stuck here while he's down there fighting on his own." Blake hesitated, then said, "I spent an hour by the window this morning." He moved his fingers a little. "I think he's trying to tell you he's okay." Naomi gave a shaky laugh. "That's what moms do, you know? We read meaning into every tiny twitch and hiccup. It's how we survive the fear." Blake leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're already an incredible mom," Naomi sobered. "I'm terrified, Blake. I'm terrified. What if he doesn't make it? What if I went through all this for nothing?" Blake reached out and covered her hand with his. "He's strong because you're strong. And if there's one thing I know about that kid, it's that he's already learned from you how to fight." Naomi squeezed his hand and then quickly pulled hers away. "This doesn't change anything between us," she said, voice guarded. "I'm still not sure I can trust you." Blake nodded. "I know. I'm not asking for trust. Just a chance to show you that I'm not the man I was that night." Naomi looked at him for a long time, then turned away toward the window. The next morning, Blake stood at his office window watching the reporters gather outside the building. Their cameras flashed, their microphones poised, waiting for a statement. Sarah entered the room. "Are you sure about this, sir? Once you go public, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Blake said. He turned and walked to the conference room. The reporters had been granted access to the space downstairs. As he stepped to the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. Blake adjusted the microphone. "Good morning," he began, voice steady. "You've all seen the video. You've read the headlines. I'm not here to deny what happened that night. I was cruel. I was arrogant. And because of my actions, a woman who was simply doing her job ended up in a hospital, fighting for her life and the life of her child." Cameras clicked. Murmurs rippled through the room. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I can change. And I will." The Donovan Hayes Foundation has already begun its work to support single mothers like Naomi Fletcher. Not as a PR stunt, but as a commitment to the values I abandoned. Naomi Fletcher showed more strength that night than I've ever displayed in my life. She is the reason for this change, and her child, who is right now fighting for every breath, is my reminder of what truly matters. He looked directly into the cameras. So go ahead and hold me accountable, but leave Naomi and her child out of it. They don't deserve to be punished for my sins. Blake stepped back, ignoring the shouted questions as he turned to leave. His phone buzzed. He checked the screen. A message from the hospital. Baby Fletcher's oxygen levels have dropped. Come immediately! Blake's vision tunneled. He bolted for the door, ignoring the reporter's shouts, running toward the only fight that mattered now. Blake Callahan ran through the hospital corridors, his breath ragged, his mind racing. The polished floors blurred beneath his feet, and the antiseptic-scented air stung his nostrils with each frantic inhale. The text message still glowed on his phone screen. Baby Fletcher's oxygen levels have dropped. Come immediately. He rounded the corner to the neonatal IQ and nearly collided with Dr. Morris, who stood outside the observation window with a grave expression. What happened? Blake demanded, chest heaving. The baby's oxygen saturation started dropping an hour ago, the doctor said. We've adjusted the ventilator settings, but his lungs are struggling. If we can't stabilize him soon, we'll have to consider more invasive measures. Blake's throat tightened. Invasive how? An advanced ventilator or possibly extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. ECMO? It's risky for a preemie this small. His body might not handle it. Blake's gaze shifted past the doctor to the tiny form in the incubator. The baby's chest heaved with visible effort, his small body consumed by the task of drawing each breath. The monitor beside the incubator displayed fluctuating oxygen levels, the numbers dipping precariously low before bouncing back with uncertainty. Does Naomi know? Blake asked. Not yet. We didn't want to alarm her until we had a clearer picture. I'll tell her, Blake said, voice low. Dr. Morris nodded. We'll do everything we can. Blake walked toward room 314, every step heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He'd never been afraid of confrontation or bad news in the business world, but this was different. This was life. Fragile, irreplaceable life. He knocked softly and stepped inside. Naomi was sitting upright, eyes fixed on her phone. When she saw Blake, she immediately sat straighter. What's wrong? She asked, voice tense. Blake knelt beside her bed, forcing himself to hold her gaze. The baby's oxygen levels dropped. The doctors are doing everything they can, but they're worried. Naomi's lips parted, and she inhaled sharply. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Blake took her hand. They're talking about switching to ECMO. It's a machine that helps oxygenate his blood while his lungs recover. But it's risky. Tears spilled down her cheeks. He's so small. How can his body handle that? Blake squeezed her hand. He's a fighter. Naomi, like you, and he's got the best team watching over him. Naomi covered her face with her free hand, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Blake sat beside her, saying nothing. There were no words capable of softening the agony of a mother fearing for her child's life after several long minutes. Naomi lowered her hand. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I want to see him now. Of course, Blake said. He signaled for a nurse. Within minutes, they had Naomi settled in a wheelchair. Blake pushed her through the corridor, each turn bringing them closer to the NICU. When they arrived, the sight of their baby struggling to breathe hit Naomi like a blow. She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. He's so still, she whispered. The ventilator hissed softly with each mechanical breath. Wires and tubes snaked across the baby's tiny body. His fingers, once so eager to twitch and grasp, now lay limp. Naomi reached through the access port and gently stroked his hand. Hi, baby, she murmured, her voice trembling. Mommy's here. I'm right here. Blake stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. He watched as her fingers moved delicately over the baby's tiny palm. What's his name? He asked softly. Naomi froze. I haven't decided yet, she admitted. Everything's been so chaotic. I wanted to meet him first, to feel the name before I gave it to him. Blake nodded. Well, he's here now. and he's fighting with everything he has. Maybe it's time. Naomi bit her lip. Eyes locked on her son. Daniel, she said at last. My dad always loved that name. Daniel Fletcher. Daniel, Blake echoed. It suits him. Strong. Resilient. Naomi smiled faintly through her tears. Yeah, my little fighter. The door behind them opened and Dr. Morris entered. His expression was carefully neutral. Ms. Fletcher, Mr. Callahan, the doctor greeted. We've done everything we can with the ventilator, but Daniel's oxygen levels remain dangerously low. We need to decide whether to move forward with ECMO. It's risky, but without it, he won't make it. Naomi's body sagged against the wheelchair. Blake knelt beside her, gripping her hand. What are the odds? Blake asked. Dr. Morris hesitated. There's a 50% survival rate for babies this premature with ECMO, but even if he survives, there could be long-term complications. Without it, Naomi asked, voice hollow. The doctor's eyes softened. He won't survive the next 12 hours. Naomi bowed her head. Her breath shallow and uneven. Blake tightened his grip on her hand. It's your call, he whispered. But whatever you decide, I'll be right here. Naomi looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. He's fought so hard, she whispered. We owe it to him to keep fighting. Blake turned to the doctor. Do it, he said. The doctor gave a brisk nod and left the room. The next hour was a blur of medical preparations. Nurses moved with practiced urgency, adjusting equipment, checking vitals, and prepping Daniel for the procedure. Naomi never let go of his tiny hand until the very last moment when the nurses gently ushered them away to the observation window. From behind the glass, Blake and Naomi watched as the doctors worked with calm precision. Tubes were inserted. Machines hummed to life. Daniel's tiny chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity as the ECMO device took over the work of his underdeveloped lungs. Naomi clutched Blake's arm. Is it working? She asked. Blake didn't know. He could only watch the monitors and hope. The machine's running, he said. Now we wait. Hours passed in oppressive silence. Naomi dozed off briefly, her head resting against Blake's shoulder. He didn't move, afraid that any shift might disturb her fragile rest. When she woke. The sky outside had turned dark. Finally, Dr. Morris reappeared, pulling off his surgical cap. Blake and Naomi stood simultaneously. He's stable, the doctor said, offering a small smile. The machine is doing its job. His oxygen levels have improved slightly. The next 24 hours will tell us more. Naomi sagged with relief, tears streaming freely now. Blake caught her as her knees buckled. He's okay for now, Blake murmured into her hair. He's still fighting. Naomi pulled back, wiping her eyes. I want to sit with him. Blake helped her back to the wheelchair and pushed her toward Daniel's bedside. The baby's chest moved rhythmically with the machine's assistance. The monitor showed numbers that, while not perfect, were better than before. Naomi reached into the incubator and touched Daniel's hand. Keep fighting, baby, she whispered. Mommy's here, and so is Daddy Blake. Blake froze at the words. Naomi's eyes widened as if realizing what she'd just said. Her cheeks flushed. I mean, you're here as someone who cares, she stammered. Blake didn't correct her. He simply stood beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder as Daniel's tiny fingers twitched beneath her touch. He wasn't Daniel's father, but in that moment, he realized he'd do anything to protect that little boy. The hospital lights cast a muted glow along the corridor as Blake Callahan sat beside Naomi Fletcher in the neonatal IQ. The soft beeping of monitors surrounded them, each sound marking another moment of fragile life. Through the glass of the incubator, Daniel lay still, his tiny chest rising and falling in sync with the machine that breathed for him. His skin, once translucent and fragile, now had a faintly healthier hue, but the doctors warned that the battle was far from over. Naomi's hand remained on the incubator's surface, her fingertips tracing invisible patterns across the glass. Her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail that sagged to one side. The weight of motherhood and fear sat heavily on her thin shoulders. Blake sat beside her, saying nothing. Words felt insufficient here, in this sacred suspended moment where life clung to thin threads of hope. He had always been a man of action. Solve the problem, find the answer, make the deal. But Daniel's fight wasn't a negotiation. It was survival in its rawest form. He's so small, Naomi whispered, her voice cracking. Blake shifted closer. Yeah, but he's strong, just like his mom. She gave a hollow laugh, her breath fogging the glass for a moment. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm falling apart every second. Strength isn't about not falling apart, Blake said softly. It's about holding on when everything's breaking. You're doing that every minute you're here. Naomi turned to him, eyes glistening. Do you ever think about how this all started? She asked. How one awful night brought us here. Blake flinched. The memory of that night at the Hudson Manor was never far from his mind. Every day, he admitted. I think about what I said to you, what I did, and how it almost destroyed you, and him. Naomi inhaled sharply and looked back at Daniel. When I was lying on that restaurant floor, I thought I'd lost him, she said. I kept thinking, I let him down before he even had a chance. Blake reached for her hand but stopped halfway, unsure if the gesture was welcome. You didn't let him down, he said. You fought. You're still fighting. Naomi exhaled slowly, her hand moving to rest on the incubator's edge. I thought I hated you, she said without looking at him. After that night, I swore I'd never let you near me or my child. But now, you're here, and you haven't left. Blake shifted in his chair. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said. I know that, but I want to be here for you, for him, if you'll let me. The weight of that offer lingered between them. Naomi didn't respond. She just sat there, her eyes locked on Daniel, her hand steady on the glass. The next few days passed in slow increments. Daniel's oxygen levels improved slightly, then dipped again. Naomi remained at his side, refusing to leave even when the nurses urged her to rest. Blake divided his time between the hospital and his collapsing business empire. The headlines hadn't softened. From boardroom king to cruel tyrant, the fall of Blake Callahan had become a viral sensation. Sarah called twice a day with updates. Protests outside the restaurants were growing, investors were pulling out. His empire was disintegrating like sand slipping through his fingers. But Blake no longer cared. His priorities had shifted to a single incubator, and the tiny boy within it. One afternoon, after returning from a short trip to his office, he entered the IQ to find Naomi asleep in the chair beside Daniel's bed. Her head rested against the incubator, and her hand was tucked inside through the access port, cradling Daniel's fingers. Blake stood there, his heart twisting. The sight of her, so fiercely protective even in sleep, stirred something deep within him, a tenderness he'd long believed himself incapable of feeling. He took a blanket from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Then he pulled a chair beside her and sat down. Hey, little guy, Blake murmured, leaning close to the incubator. You've got the best mom in the world, you know that. She's here every second, fighting for you. So you gotta fight for her too, okay? Daniel's tiny fingers twitched beneath the clear plastic shell. The movement made Blake smile. Yeah, he whispered. I see you, buddy. You're listening. The hours slipped by. Nurses came and went, checking monitors and adjusting medications. At one point, Naomi stirred, blinking blearily at him. You're still here, she mumbled. Always, Blake said softly. She gave him a faint smile before drifting back to sleep. Later that night, Dr. Morris entered the IQ, his expression cautious. Mr. Callahan, Ms. Fletcher, he said, gently rousing Naomi from her sleep. We've run more tests. Daniel's oxygen levels have stabilized for the last 12 hours. It's a positive sign. Naomi sat up straight. Stable. Does that mean he's improving? It means he's holding steady, the doctor said. If this continues, we might try reducing his dependency on the ventilator in a few days. Naomi let out a choked sob of relief. Blake felt his own chest ease for the first time in days. Thank you, doctor, Blake said. Dr. Morris nodded and left them alone. Naomi turned to Blake, eyes shining. He's getting stronger. He is, Blake said, squeezing her hand. Naomi squeezed back. This time, she didn't let go. The next morning, the sun spilled through the hospital windows, casting a soft glow over Daniel's tiny form. Blake brought coffee for Naomi, who accepted it with a grateful smile. As they sat in silence, the monitor beside Daniel emitted a soft chime. The oxygen saturation level had ticked up another point. Naomi gasped. He's doing it, she whispered. He's breathing a little better. Blake wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Yeah, he said, voice thick with emotion. He's showing us how it's done. Hours later, Blake stepped outside to stretch his legs. His phone buzzed again. Sarah. Sarah, he answered. Mr. Callahan, you need to come to the office now. Why, I told you. It's not about the restaurants, Sarah interrupted. It's the foundation. There's been a development. A woman came forward with information about Donovan Hayes. Blake's blood ran cold. What kind of information? She claims your mentor, Donovan Hayes, wasn't the man you thought he was, Sarah said. She has documents, allegations of fraud, and she says Naomi's father stole money to prop up your business. Blake's vision blurred. That's impossible. I don't know, Sarah said. But the media's already running with it. And Naomi, she's going to find out. Blake stood frozen, the ground shifting beneath his feet. The foundation, the trust, the fragile bond he'd begun to build with Naomi. It was all about to implode. Blake Callahan stood in the hospital courtyard, his phone still pressed against his ear long after Sarah had hung up. The chill of the evening air gnawed at his skin, but it couldn't compete with the cold dread spreading through his chest. Donovan Hayes, fraud, stolen money. The words spun in his head like shards of broken glass. Donovan had been more than a mentor. He had been a father figure, the man who taught him the principles of business, the value of hard work, the importance of people. Could it have all been a lie? And if it was, what would that mean for the foundation he had named in Donovan's honor? For Naomi, who still clung to the belief that her father had been a man of integrity. Blake ran a hand through his hair, trying to think through the suffocating confusion. His instincts told him to rush to his office, demand answers from Sarah, investigate every allegation until the truth was laid bare. But his heart pulled him in a different direction. Naomi, she would find out soon enough. And if she heard it from anyone but him, the fragile trust they'd built would crumble completely. He forced his feet to move, walking back into the hospital and taking the elevator to the maternity floor. As the doors opened, his stomach knotted tighter. He wasn't sure how to tell her. How could he destroy the legacy of the man she believed had been her father's friend? The door to Naomi's room was partially open when he arrived. He knocked lightly and stepped inside. She sat in bed with her phone in hand, scrolling through something. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Hey," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Did you know?" Her voice was low, strained. Blake's heart dropped. "Naomi." She turned the phone toward him. The screen displayed a news article with a bold headline. "The Truth Behind the Callahan Empire, Donovan Hayes and the Missing Millions." Below the headline was a photograph of Donovan shaking hands with Blake in front of the first Callahan restaurant. The caption read, "Hayes allegedly diverted funds from employee pensions to finance Callahan's rise to success." Blake sat heavily in the chair beside her bed. "I just found out," he said. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "Is it true?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Sarah called me an hour ago. Someone came forward with documents, but I swear to you, Naomi, I had no idea." She shook her head, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "My father wouldn't do something like that. He was honest. He taught me to be honest." "I thought the same," Blake said, voice cracking. "He was the man who pulled me out of the gutter, who told me integrity mattered more than profit. I can't believe it either." Naomi's breath caught. "And if it's true, if he stole from those people, from the pension fund," Blake hesitated, "then we'll face it together. The foundation stands for something bigger than Donovan or me. It's about helping people like you. Like Daniel, we'll make it right, no matter what." Naomi turned her face away, staring out the window. "I trusted you," she whispered, "and now it feels like my whole life was built on a lie." Blake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know how it feels. Donovan saved me when I had nothing. I built this empire thinking it was his legacy. If that legacy was tainted, then I'll tear it down piece by piece if I have to." Naomi said nothing. The tension in the room was suffocating. A knock at the door interrupted the silence. A nurse peeked inside. "Ms. Fletcher, Daniel's oxygen levels have stabilized again. We thought you'd like to know." Naomi gave a shaky nod. The nurse smiled reassuringly and left. "Good," Naomi said absently, her hand gripping the blanket. "He's holding on." Blake exhaled in relief. Yeah, he's tough. Naomi wiped at her cheeks. I need some time to process all of this, Blake. I can't deal with you and Daniel and this scandal all at once. I understand, Blake said softly. But I promise you I'm not running from this. I'll get to the truth. Naomi didn't respond. She just stared at the window, lost in her thoughts. Blake left the room feeling hollow. The next morning, he walked into his corporate office for the first time in weeks. The lobby was quieter than usual. Staff members avoided eye contact. The receptionist gave him a nervous smile as he passed by. Sarah was waiting for him in the conference room, a stack of papers spread across the table. I pulled everything I could find, she said, gesturing to the documents. Bank statements, audit reports, pension fund records. Blake sat down and scanned the papers. The numbers blurred together at first. Then, near the bottom of a ledger from 10 years earlier, he saw it. A series of unexplained withdrawals from the pension fund of Hayes Enterprises. The transactions were dated just weeks before Donovan had invested in Callahan restaurants. Blake's stomach dropped. This can't be right. Sarah's voice was hesitant. It looks bad, sir. The withdrawals match the amount he invested in your first restaurant. Blake slumped back in his chair. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. Donovan, the man who'd preached about ethics and integrity, had possibly built Blake's career on stolen money. What do we do? Sarah asked. Blake squeezed his eyes shut. He wanted to bury the truth, to protect Donovan's memory and shield Naomi from the pain. But that instinct, that ruthless self-preservation, was the old Blake, the man he was trying to leave behind. Release the documents, Blake said. All of them. Make a public statement. The Foundation won't hide the truth, no matter what it costs us. Sarah's eyes widened. That could destroy everything. Blake stood. If it's built on a lie, it deserves to be destroyed. Hours later, the press conference was broadcast live across every major network. Blake stood at the podium, the documents displayed on a screen behind him. He gripped the sides of the podium and spoke clearly. I built my business with the help of Donovan Hayes, a man I considered my mentor and a father figure. I recently learned that the funds he invested were likely stolen from the pension accounts of his former employees. I didn't know this at the time, but ignorance doesn't absolve me of responsibility. The Donovan Hayes Foundation will be restructured to compensate the victims. We will honor the intention behind the foundation, even if the name itself no longer represents the values we stand for. Reporters shouted questions. But Blake turned and walked away. That night, he returned to the hospital. Naomi was awake, sitting in the chair beside Daniel's incubator. She looked up as he entered. I saw the press conference, she said softly. Blake sat beside her. I couldn't hide it. Not from you. Not from anyone. Naomi exhaled slowly. My father. He really did it, didn't he? Blake took her hand. The records say he did. But I know the man who raised you, Naomi. The man who raised you to be strong and kind. That part was real. No scandal can take that away. Tears filled her eyes. Daniel deserves a better legacy than this. Then let's build one, Blake said. Together? Naomi hesitated, then squeezed his hand. And through the glass, Daniel's tiny hand twitched as if echoing their silent resolve. The soft hum of hospital monitors filled the quiet space as Blake Callahan stood beside Daniel's incubator. His fingertips brushed the cool glass, eyes fixed on the tiny chest rising and falling beneath the tangle of wires and tubes. The ECMO machine continued its steady work, oxygenating the baby's fragile lungs while his body fought to grow stronger. Behind him, Naomi sat in the chair, her posture slouched with exhaustion. The past days had taken a toll on both of them. The revelation about her father had hit like a wrecking ball, shattering what little stability she'd managed to hold on to since Daniel's premature birth. The scandal had spread like wildfire, with news outlets running headline after headline about Donovan Hayes' alleged fraud. The foundation's credibility had been decimated overnight, and through it all, Daniel remained here, suspended between life and uncertainty. Blake turned to face her. You should rest, he said softly. Naomi shook her head. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see the headlines. I see Daniel struggling to breathe. It's like I'm stuck in a nightmare that won't end. Blake lowered himself into the chair beside her. I know the feeling, he said. The company's hemorrhaging money. Investors are jumping ship. the board's demanding I step down." He gave a humorless laugh. "Turns out the world doesn't like businessmen who build empires on stolen money." Naomi's eyes softened. "You didn't know?" "No," Blake said, "but it was still my company, my success, and it came from something rotten. That's on me." Naomi squeezed his hand, surprising him. "You didn't choose this, but you're choosing what to do now. I saw your press conference. You didn't hide or lie. You stood there and told the truth, even when it destroyed everything you built." Blake's throat tightened. "I owed that to you, to Daniel, to everyone we were supposed to help." Naomi gave a weary nod and turned back toward the incubator. Daniel's tiny fingers twitched, and she smiled faintly. "He's stronger than we think," she whispered. "Just like my dad always said I was." Blake hesitated. "I meant what I said in that press conference. The foundation's name is gone, but the mission stays. I want you to help me rebuild it." Naomi's gaze shifted to him, surprise flickering across her face. "Me? You know what it's like to work hard, to struggle, to face people who think you're invisible," Blake said. "You'll fight for those women the way no one else will." "I can't do this without you." Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden, shrill alarm from the monitor cut her off. The heart monitor beside Daniel spiked, the rhythm erratic. His oxygen levels plummeted in seconds. Nurses rushed in, the room transforming into a blur of movement and urgency. Blake and Naomi were ushered away from the incubator as the medical team swarmed in. "What's happening?" Naomi cried. "His oxygen levels have dropped again," Dr. Morris said, arriving with hurried strides. "The machine isn't compensating the way we expected." "Do something!" Naomi shouted. Blake wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Holding her as she shook with panic, he couldn't take his eyes off Daniel's tiny form, now surrounded by gloved hands and urgent voices. "Switch to manual ventilation," a nurse called. Another alarm sounded, more insistent. Blake felt Naomi's knees buckle beneath her. He held her tighter, anchoring her in place even as his own heart fractured. Every instinct screamed for him to act, to fix it, solve it, but there was nothing he could do. "Doctor," Morris barked commands to the team, his forehead beaded with sweat. The minutes dragged like hours. Finally, the alarm stopped. The chaotic energy in the room dissipated into tense silence. Dr. Morris turned to face them. "He's stable again," he said, voice tight. "But his body is fighting the machine. If it happens again, we might not get him back." Naomi covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Blake's vision blurred as he held her. "Is there anything else we can do?" Blake asked. "We can try weaning him off the ECMO, Doctor." Morris said, "But it's risky. His lungs may not be ready." "What's the alternative?" Naomi asked, voice trembling. "Prolonging his time on the machine could cause permanent damage to his heart and brain," the doctor said. "We need to decide soon." Naomi sagged against Blake, her strength drained. Blake knelt beside her chair. "Naomi," he said gently, "we need to make a decision." Her eyes met his, wide with helplessness. "What if we make the wrong one?" He held her hand tightly. "We make the best decision we can for Daniel, together." She drew in a shaky breath and looked toward the incubator. "He's fought so hard, maybe. Maybe it's time to let him try on his own." Blake nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." The next few hours were a blur of preparations. Machines were recalibrated, medications adjusted, and additional respiratory specialists consulted. The tension in the room thickened as they approached the moment of truth. Finally, Dr. Morris gave them a nod. "We're ready." Blake stood behind Naomi as she sat at Daniel's side. The doctor inserted a syringe into the ECMO machine and slowly began the process of weaning Daniel from the mechanical support. The numbers on the monitor shifted immediately. Oxygen saturation dipped. Naomi squeezed Blake's hand, her knuckles white. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "You can do this." The heart rate monitor beeped faster. Daniel's chest strained with each breath. The oxygen level dropped from 92 to 85. Blake felt his stomach drop. The number hovered, then dipped to 82. Naomi bit her lip so hard it drew blood. Daniel's tiny fingers twitched. The monitor hit 80. Then, slowly, it ticked upward. The respirator adjusted to the change. The baby's chest continued to rise and fall, slow but steady. The number climbed. 85, 86, 87. The nurses exchanged cautious glances. Blake held his breath. 88, 89, 90, doctor. Morris exhaled audibly. He's doing it, he said, relief spreading across his face. He's breathing on his own. Naomi broke into sobs. Blake wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair as his own tears fell. They stood there together, shaking, weeping, watching the tiny miracle unfold before their eyes. Daniel Fletcher, the boy who had been born into chaos and fear, was breathing without the machine. Later, after the monitors settled into a steady rhythm, Naomi pressed her hand against the glass of the incubator. "You're my hero, little guy," she whispered. "You never gave up." Blake stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Neither did you," he said. Naomi turned to face him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for fighting with us." "I made a promise," Blake said, "and I intend to keep it." She studied his face, searching for something. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek. It was just a moment, a brief, fragile connection. But for Blake, it was enough. As they sat beside the incubator that night, watching Daniel breathe without the machine, Blake realized something profound. Legacies weren't about money or reputation. They were about love, resilience, and the quiet, unwavering fight for those who mattered. And this was the legacy they were building together. Blake Callahan stood at the window of the hospital's neonatal IQ, his reflection merging with the city lights beyond the glass. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, hopeful glow across the horizon. It had been 3 days since Daniel was weaned off the ECMO machine. 3 days of cautious monitoring, sleepless nights, and endless prayers whispered to an indifferent universe. But against the odds, Daniel was breathing on his own. His oxygen levels, once terrifyingly unstable, now held steady. His tiny body still relied on supplemental oxygen, but the machines no longer dictated every breath. Each inhalation was his own, a testament to his stubborn will to live. Behind Blake, Naomi sat beside the incubator, her face soft with exhaustion and relief. She hadn't left Daniel's side for more than a few minutes since the procedure. Her hand rested inside the access port, her fingers lightly stroking Daniel's tiny arm. "He's getting stronger," Blake said quietly, not turning from the window. Naomi's voice was soft but steady. "Yeah, he's a fighter." Blake smiled faintly. "Must run in the family." Naomi gave a tired laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe he just doesn't know any other way." Blake finally turned around and sat beside her. Daniel's chest rose and fell beneath the thin hospital blanket, each breath a small miracle. "The doctors said we might be able to take him home in a few weeks," Naomi said. "Home? I never thought I'd get to say that." Blake rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the stiffness that came with too many hours sitting in the hospital chair. "Have you thought about where home will be?" Naomi bit her bottom lip. "I guess the apartment you arranged for me, it's safe, quiet. That's what we need right now." Blake hesitated. "You don't have to stay there. You don't. You know, I can find you a bigger place. Somewhere with more space, more light. Somewhere Daniel can grow up with a backyard." She gave him a guarded look. "I appreciate it, Blake, but I can't live in a house you pay for. I need to know I can stand on my own." Blake nodded, though disappointment tugged at him. He respected her independence. It was one of the things he admired most about her. "Then let me help you get on your feet. The foundation will support you until you're back to work." Naomi shook her head. "The foundation needs to focus on other mothers, women who don't have anyone fighting for them. I have you. That's already more than I expected." The words hit him harder than he anticipated. He had spent so long trying to earn her forgiveness, unsure if it would ever come. And now, she was acknowledging his presence as something reliable, something real. "Okay," he said softly. "Then what if you help me run it?" "The foundation, I mean," Naomi blinked. "Me. You're the reason it exists," Blake said. "You understand what it means to struggle, to fight for every dollar, every opportunity. You can make sure we never lose sight of the people we're trying to help." Naomi hesitated. "I don't know, Blake. I'm not a businesswoman. I waited tables. I lived paycheck to paycheck. I don't know how to run a foundation." "You know more than you think," Blake said. "You're smart, resourceful, and you care. That's what matters. I'll teach you the rest." Naomi's fingers brushed Daniel's arm. The baby's hand twitched in response, his tiny fingers curling around her thumb. Her eyes filled with tears. "My father spent his life trying to give me a future," she said softly. "And now I find out he might have stolen from others to do it. I don't want Daniel to carry that shame. I want him to know that our family stands for something good." "Then let's build that," Blake said. "Together. A foundation that helps mothers, children, families. We'll make sure every dollar is accounted for, every action transparent. No secrets, no lies." Naomi met his gaze, searching for any trace of manipulation or self-interest. When she found none, she exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said at last. "Let's do it." Blake smiled, relief washing over him. "We'll start with a new name, something that reflects what we're really about." Naomi considered for a moment. "Hope Haven Foundation." "Hope Haven," Blake repeated, tasting the words. "I love it." The door opened, and Dr. Morris entered. "Good morning," he greeted, checking Daniel's monitor. "Our little fighter is doing great. If this keeps up, we might start discussing discharge plans soon." Naomi covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. Blake squeezed her hand. After the doctor left, they sat in silence for a while, absorbing the enormity of what lay ahead. Daniel's survival had been uncertain from the moment he entered the world. Now, the possibility of taking him home, of giving him a life beyond these sterile walls, felt within reach. Blake stood and stretched. "I should go," he said. "I have a meeting with the Foundation's legal team to finalize the name change." Naomi nodded. But as he turned to leave, she called after him. "Blake." He stopped at the door. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He gave a small smile. "I haven't done everything yet, but I will." 2 weeks later, Daniel was discharged. Naomi dressed him in a tiny blue onesie that Blake had brought from a local boutique. A soft, sky-colored outfit embroidered with the words "Little Fighter" across the chest. As they left the hospital, Naomi cradled Daniel in her arms. Blake walked beside her, carrying the diaper bag and car seat. The sunlight was warm on their faces, and the noise of the city beyond the hospital walls seemed to welcome them into a new chapter. Blake opened the car door and helped secure Daniel in the car seat. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Naomi slid into the passenger seat. Blake hesitated before closing the door. "What's wrong?" Naomi asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just this moment. It's big." Naomi smiled. "Yeah, it is." Blake closed the door, got into the driver's seat, and started the car. As they drove toward Naomi's apartment, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Daniel's tiny face was partially obscured by the car seat straps, but his chest rose and fell steadily. Naomi reached for Blake's hand. He took it without hesitation as they crossed the city. Passing the first restaurant Blake had ever opened, the same thought echoed in both their minds. This was the start of something new, a life not built on shame or regret, but on hope, love, and resilience.